I'm delighted now to be joined by the former Chief Scientific Advisor and head of what they style as the independent sage. So it's a group of experts who sort of challenge the official advisors to the government. Sir David King. Sir David, very good to see you. You were Chief Scientific Advisor only a few years ago. You will have seen earlier this week the evidence that the Prime Minister rejected the advice that his scientific advisors gave. On September the 21st, they recommended we should go for a circuit-breaking national lockdown, that there should be closure of hairdressers and restaurants and pubs, and that students should be taught online rather than going back to university in the normal way. All of this advice ignored by the Prime Minister. If your advice had been ignored by a Prime Minister, do you think you could have stayed in your job?
I certainly would have attempted to stay in my job, but what I certainly would have done is come to people like you, Robert, and talked about what the advice was, why the advice was being given, and what the need is and was for absolutely rapid decision-making by the Prime Minister. I mean, what they advised way back, September 23rd, came in the face of this rapidly increasing second wave. And what we haven't seemed to learn in government is what happened back in March. When the epidemic was increasing at a factor of 4 every week, it was doubling every 3 to 4 days, there was a long delay before we went into lockdown. And this delay followed the fact that the test and trace system that we had wasn't able to reach the number of people who were ill. So what I want to say now is, what do we need to do to bring an epidemic under control? And there's only 3 things. One is, we need to see that everyone who has the disease is put into isolation within 24 hours of their declaring that they've got the symptoms and being tested. And we have to see that every one of their contacts over the previous 2 weeks is also put into isolation, and that this is effective. If we can't do that, we have to take a more blunt instrument, which is going into lockdown, which is now being discussed and was suggested once again. Now, when that blunt instrument was used on March the 23rd, we had seen, because of the delay, this massive increase in the number of people who were infected in the country. The impact of that is twofold. One, the number of fatalities was not 5,000 as it could have been. It was more, as we know, now 45,000 fatalities. It could have been massively reduced by taking action quickly. Now, you would think we would have learnt the lesson from that. We finally have SAGE publishing their minutes. They didn't go out publicly right away. And their minutes very clearly said we need to go into a mini lockdown. That means a fixed period lockdown. Now, as it happens, I don't agree that this is quite the right way forward. I mean, we believe SAGE is getting it right now. But what we also need is to see that the test and trace and isolate system is brought up to the point where it is fully functional. Now, if we look at countries like Germany or Korea or Hong Kong, they got into that situation very quickly.
So David, I'm just going to stop you for a moment, because I do want to develop all of this with you. I think, everybody watching wants to know what the right way forward is. So if you could just bear with us, we're just going to go for a quick break, and we'll be back. Welcome back. I'm delighted that the former Chief Scientific Advisor and Head of Independent SAGE, David King, is still with me. David, I think you were saying that actually where we are now, you would not be going for a circuit-breaking national lockdown. Is that what you said?
I am all in favour of going into a circuit-breaking national lockdown, a modified lockdown of some kind. But what I am saying is we need a strategy for getting this epidemic under control. And the only way to get an epidemic under control is if you can isolate everyone who has the disease or was exposed to somebody who has the disease from the rest of the population.
So how would you fix test and trace? So how would you fix test and trace? Because that's what everybody wants to know.
So that's the key. If we have a functional test and trace, we can manage this. So I would say go into that lockdown immediately. If we'd have gone into this second lockdown on the 23rd of September, we'd have been seeing more like 5,000 cases a day, not approaching 20,000. If we just delay it for another few days, we're going to see that number rise. It's going to be more and more difficult to chase all of these cases. So I believe we need to go into a lockdown until we have a test and trace system that is picking up the majority, vast majority, of all of the new cases within 24 hours, and a control system that puts people into isolation properly. Now, what that means is we also have to introduce support for people going into isolation who are losing their income.
Sure. Michelle O'Neill made exactly the same point as that.
Right.
But what do you see as the... I mean, is there a structural problem with test and trace? What would be the reform that you would like to see?
There's a massive structural problem with test and trace. It's in the private sector with two companies with no healthcare experience. They've got a board with almost zero healthcare experience, and they believe they can step in and operate this from the centre. Well, the bit of the test and trace system that is working is the test and trace system under the National Health Service. So what we need to do is put more money into the National Health Service, stop feeding money into these two private companies, and operate the National Health Service test and trace system locally so that we can get it fully up and running. Now, I'm afraid...
But wouldn't that take weeks and weeks?
It
could take months, couldn't it?
I think it'll take 4 to 6 weeks to get that operative. But if we don't do this, Robert, we will see our economy once again going totally pear-shaped, because this epidemic is heading the same direction as that first big wave we had in March for the same reason, because we're delaying making the right decisions. And if we don't understand that this test and trace system is not going to deliver, if we don't understand that the National Health Service system that is already beginning to contribute significantly to this ought to be brought fully up to scratch, if we don't understand, stop using call centres to tell people to isolate, we need to send people locally out using shoe leather to talk to people, make sure, ring their doorbells, make sure they're isolating. So I think all of this could be put right. I mean, it could be done in a shorter period of time, but it needs to start tonight in order to get this out of the situation where we're once again going to wreck our economy and see a very large number of further people dying and a very much larger number of people getting long COVID and suffering really terribly from this disease.
David, as always, it's a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you will join us again